I understood the cost of being seen long before I understood what it meant to be honest, and that realization came to me in my boss's office, with the door closed and the city humming faintly through glass that made everything outside feel unreachable. I had made a mistake, an undeniable one, the kind that couldn't be softened by excuses or hidden behind competence. It wasn't malicious or dramatic, just careless, born of exhaustion and the quiet arrogance of thinking I could fix something later. Later never came. The consequence did. My boss didn't raise his voice. That would have been easier. He sat there, hands folded, disappointment resting on his face like something carefully practiced, and told me that trust was a currency I had just spent without permission. When he proposed his solution, it didn't sound like punishment at first. It sounded like containment. Damage control. An alternative to formal discipline that would follow me like a shadow if documented. I remember nodding before I fully understood, because nodding had always been my reflex when authority leaned in. It was only when he explained the specifics, slowly, deliberately, that my throat tightened and the room seemed to tilt. I would become his assistant. Publicly. Visibly. Not the assistant I had been training for in my career projections, but a role crafted to correct me by unmaking something I had always guarded, how I was perceived. The position would be temporary, he said. Corrective. A lesson in accountability and humility. He spoke about professionalism, optics, and responsibility, and only later did he name the part that turned my pulse into static, that I would present as female while doing it. I didn't say no. That fact has followed me more faithfully than any title I've ever held. I didn't say no because the alternative was worse, because fear has a way of masquerading as reason, because I had never practiced refusal when the stakes were social survival. I told myself it was just clothes, just a role, just time. I told myself that identity was something solid inside me that couldn't be touched by appearances. That was the first lie I told myself, and not the last. The first morning I arrived early, hoping to avoid being seen. I had been given instructions that were precise but not cruel, clinical in their language. There was no mockery in them, which somehow made them heavier. The mirror in the restroom showed me someone unfamiliar not because of what I was wearing, but because of how carefully I was standing, how alert my eyes were, as if I had stepped into a version of myself that needed constant monitoring. What unsettled me most wasn't embarrassment, it was awareness. I noticed how the hallway felt longer, how my footsteps sounded louder, how my body occupied space differently once I believed it did. People looked at me and didn't see what they used to see. Some didn't look at all. Some smiled with a politeness that felt newly calibrated. No one laughed. That, too, surprised me. The work itself was ordinary. Calendars, emails, coordination. The kind of labor that rarely gets praised but collapses everything when it's absent. I had dismissed it before, without meaning to. Now I performed it with a meticulousness that bordered on reverence, partly because I wanted to be flawless, partly because I was afraid of giving anyone a reason to reduce me further. My boss treated me differently as well, not better, not worse, just with a formality that emphasized the boundaries I hadn't known were there before. He never referenced the arrangement directly. The silence around it was thick, instructive. I began to understand that this wasn't about humiliation. It was about exposure, being placed in a position where I had to confront how much of my confidence had been built on being unexamined. Outside of work, I told no one. I let friendships drift under the weight of unreturned messages. I avoided my family with rehearsed busyness. The secrecy wasn't just fear of judgment, it was confusion. I didn't know what story to tell because I didn't know which parts of it were true. Was this something being done to me, or something revealing itself through me? I resented the question even as it persisted. There were moments, quiet ones, when I caught myself adjusting without thinking, responding to my name as it was spoken now, noticing a softness in my reactions that hadn't felt available to me before. These moments frightened me more than the stares ever could. They suggested permeability, the possibility that identity was not a fixed object but a conversation, one I had been avoiding my entire life. I also began to see others more clearly. How often women were interrupted. How instructions were phrased differently. How competence was received with surprise instead of expectation. None of this was new information, but information lived in the body carries a different authority. I found myself listening more, speaking less, absorbing the texture of interactions I had once skimmed over. At night, I lay awake replaying the day, not with shame exactly, but with a strange attentiveness, as if I were studying a version of myself I had never been taught to understand. I didn't feel liberated. I didn't feel trapped. I felt implicated, in my own assumptions, in my past dismissals, in the narrowness with which I had defined strength. The arrangement was supposed to last 3 months. That timeline hovered like a finish line I didn't know how to approach. Part of me counted the days with relief. Another part, quieter and more unsettling, wondered what exactly I would be returning to when it ended, and whether that version of me would still fit. I hadn't become someone else yet. But I had stopped being able to pretend that who I was had ever been as simple as I claimed. Time stopped feeling like a straight line after that first week. It began to fold in on itself, days looping back with subtle differences, each one testing a slightly altered version of me. I had assumed the difficulty would peak early, that once I learned the mechanics of presentation, once the novelty wore off, the rest would be endurance. Instead, it deepened. Familiarity didn't blunt the experience, it sharpened it. The hardest part wasn't being seen. It was being remembered. People adjusted faster than I did. They learned my new name, my new role, the cadence of my presence, and then they built expectations around that version of me. I watched it happen in real time, the way identities crystallize not from declarations but from repetition. Someone would ask me for help without hesitation. Someone else would apologize for interrupting me mid-sentence, then do it again 5 minutes later without noticing. These weren't cruelties. They were habits, quiet, unexamined, inherited. I started keeping a mental ledger, not to tally slights, but to understand patterns. I had always believed myself observant, but observation without consequence is a luxury. Now every interaction left a residue. When I spoke and wasn't heard, I felt it physically, a tightening behind my ribs. When my work was praised, it was often framed as diligence rather than initiative, reliability rather than insight. None of it was false. But it was incomplete in a way that echoed. At home, the rituals of preparation lengthened. What had once been a rushed routine became deliberate, almost meditative. Not because I enjoyed it, at least not at first, but because mistakes felt amplified. A misplaced detail could shift the entire tone of the day. I learned the weight of anticipation, the mental load of planning not just what I would do, but how I would be interpreted doing it. This wasn't vanity. It was risk management. There were mornings I stared at my reflection longer than necessary, not searching for beauty or reassurance, but for continuity. I needed to know where yesterday's self ended and today's began. Some days the boundary felt clear. Others, it dissolved. I noticed expressions that felt more natural now, postures I no longer corrected. I told myself these were adaptations, situational responses. That explanation satisfied me until it didn't. The office became a kind of classroom, though no one had consented to teach me. I learned how proximity changed conversations, how being alone with a superior carried a different charge, how praise could feel conditional even when it was sincere. I learned how often I softened my language without realizing it, how often I apologized as punctuation rather than necessity. Each realization came with resistance. I didn't want these habits. I didn't choose them. And yet they arrived, uninvited but persistent. One afternoon, a colleague confided in me. It wasn't dramatic, just a frustration about workload, about being overlooked. The exchange was brief, but it unsettled me more than any overt confrontation. No one had ever confided in me like that before. Not because I wasn't trustworthy, but because I hadn't been legible in that way. I had occupied a space that discouraged vulnerability, even as I claimed to value openness. Now, I was receiving truths I hadn't known how to ask for. I began to question my past with an intensity that bordered on grief. Memories resurfaced unannounced, moments when I had spoken over someone, when I had assumed neutrality where there was privilege, when I had dismissed discomfort because it wasn't mine. These recollections weren't accusations, they were invitations, to reckon, to revise. Accountability, I realized, wasn't a punishment imposed from outside. It was a muscle that atrophied without use. My boss remained distant, but not indifferent. Occasionally, our eyes would meet across the room, and I wondered what he saw: regret, justification, experiment. I stopped trying to guess. His intentions mattered less now than the effects. Whatever this arrangement had begun as, it had outgrown its origin. It was no longer about correcting an error. It was about confronting a self I had insulated from consequence. Outside the office, my isolation grew conspicuous. I avoided mirrors in public spaces. I took longer routes to avoid casual encounters. When my mother called, I let it ring, then sat with the guilt like a familiar ache. I told myself I was protecting them, that explanation would complicate things unnecessarily. The truth was simpler and harder. I didn't know how to narrate myself without collapsing into fragments. There were moments of unexpected calm. Walking home at dusk, the city softened, edges blurred by fading light. In those moments, I felt present in a way that surprised me. Not content, exactly, but aligned, my internal tempo matching the world's pace. These instances frightened me because they lacked struggle. They suggested that ease was possible here, that resistance wasn't the only honest response. I also noticed anger, mine and others. Mine surfaced quietly, as fatigue, as irritability at small inefficiencies. Others' anger arrived sideways, through skepticism, through jokes that hovered just short of offense. I learned to navigate it with diplomacy, to deflect without diminishing myself. This skill, too, was new. I had never needed it before. One evening, alone, I tried to imagine the end of this period. The idea no longer felt like relief. It felt like erasure. Not because I wanted to remain as I was, but because I couldn't unlearn what I now knew. Returning to my previous role would not restore ignorance. It would demand integration, of insights, of humility, of responsibility. I wrote notes to myself then, not a journal exactly, but fragments. Observations. Questions without answers. I wrote about how identity seemed less like a destination and more like a practice. How empathy wasn't an abstract virtue but a discipline that required proximity. How power revealed itself most clearly when it was absent. I didn't yet have language for what was happening inside me. Labels felt premature, constricting. What I had was awareness, and awareness, once awakened, is difficult to silence. I understood now that this experience was not something to endure, but something to answer. The question was no longer whether I would change, but how consciously I would participate in that change. By the second month, the experience stopped feeling like something that was happening to me and began to feel like something that was happening through me, and that distinction mattered more than I was prepared for. It was the difference between endurance and participation, between waiting something out and realizing that waiting itself was a choice. The office no longer felt hostile or unfamiliar. That frightened me. I had expected discomfort to be the constant reminder that this was temporary, that I was inhabiting a role rather than allowing it to inhabit me. Instead, I moved through my days with a growing competence that wasn't just professional, but social. I knew where to stand during meetings. I knew when to speak and when silence would be interpreted as agreement rather than disengagement. I knew which expressions invited collaboration and which shut it down. None of this was taught. It was absorbed, quietly, the way children learn norms long before they learn to question them. What unsettled me was how much of this knowledge had always existed around me, unnoticed. I had walked past it for years, benefiting from it without understanding its cost. Now, every small interaction felt weighted, not with fear, but with meaning. When someone thanked me, I wondered what version of gratitude they were offering. When someone overlooked me, I noticed how quickly I excused it. I began to recognize the internal negotiations that preceded every response. How much space am I allowed to take here? How much insistence will be tolerated before it becomes a flaw? There was a meeting one morning that stayed with me. I had prepared extensively, anticipating questions, organizing information with care. When the discussion turned toward my area of responsibility, I spoke with clarity and confidence. The response was polite, even positive. And then, moments later, someone else restated my point almost verbatim and received a level of engagement I hadn't. No one was cruel about it. No one seemed aware. The meeting moved on. I sat there, hands folded, feeling something old and new at the same time. Old, because I recognized the dynamic instantly. New, because I could no longer distance myself from it. I had always understood this phenomenon intellectually. Experiencing it made the understanding heavier, more personal, impossible to dismiss as anecdotal. It wasn't anger that lingered afterward. It was clarity. That clarity began to reshape how I thought about responsibility. I had entered this arrangement believing my mistake was singular, isolated. A lapse in judgment, an error to be corrected so I could return to baseline. But baseline, I realized, had never been neutral. It had been cushioned. The consequences I feared now were ones I had unconsciously avoided for years, protected by assumptions about competence, authority, and belonging. I found myself revisiting past decisions with an unfamiliar rigor. Times I had delegated without considering burden. Times I had spoken confidently without being correct and been forgiven for it. Times I had been praised for leadership when I was simply the most visible person in the room. These reflections weren't self-flagellation. They were inventory. I was learning what I had been carrying without noticing. Outside work, the world pressed closer. Errands took longer, not because of obstacles, but because I moved more deliberately. I noticed how people offered help I hadn't asked for, how advice arrived unsolicited, how concern was sometimes a mask for doubt. I learned to accept assistance without resentment, to evaluate intention without assuming condescension. This, too, required practice. Independence, I discovered, had been one of my most guarded virtues. Letting it bend felt like failure until it didn't. One afternoon, a stranger addressed me with a familiarity that startled me. The exchange was brief and unremarkable, but it lingered. It reminded me how visible I was now, not as an individual with a history, but as a symbol others felt entitled to interpret. I had opinions assigned to me, vulnerabilities presumed, limits imagined. It was disorienting to realize how often I had done the same to others without malice, without awareness. The isolation I had cultivated began to crack under its own weight. I missed conversation that wasn't strategic, connection that didn't require calculation. When a close friend finally confronted me about my absence, I deflected at first, offering vague explanations that satisfied neither of us. The silence that followed was heavier than any reaction I had feared. That night, I understood that secrecy was no longer protecting me. It was diminishing me. Telling him was one of the hardest things I have ever done, not because of what I said, but because of what I risked losing by saying it. I spoke carefully, avoiding grand conclusions, framing the situation as temporary, professional, corrective. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he didn't ask the questions I expected. He asked how I was sleeping. Whether I felt safe. Whether I felt like myself. I didn't know how to answer that last question. The honesty of my uncertainty surprised us both. He didn't offer reassurance or judgment. He offered presence. That, more than anything, unsettled me. It made space for something I had been avoiding, the possibility that this experience was not just revealing injustice, but revealing me. I began to notice moments of choice where before there had only been reflex. How I responded to my name. How I corrected assumptions. How I advocated for myself without apology. These moments were small, but they accumulated. I wasn't becoming someone else. I was becoming more deliberate about who I was allowed to be. My boss called me into his office again near the end of the second month. The conversation was measured, professional. He acknowledged my performance, my adaptability. He reminded me of the remaining timeline. I listened, nodding, aware of a strange calm settling over me. The outcome mattered less than it once had. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood now that no resolution could undo what had already been integrated. When I left his office, I didn't feel relief or dread. I felt responsibility, toward myself, toward what I had learned, toward how I would carry it forward. Whatever happened next, I would not be able to claim ignorance again. I would not be able to say I didn't know how systems pressed on people, how identity shaped experience, how easily confidence could be mistaken for merit. That night, alone, I stood by the window and watched the city move without me. I realized that transformation is rarely announced. It happens quietly, through repetition, through discomfort, through moments of unexpected grace. It asks not whether we are willing to change, but whether we are willing to notice that we already have. I was no longer counting the days until this ended. I was counting the ways it would stay with me. The final weeks did not arrive with a sense of climax. They arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as if time itself didn't want to draw attention to what it was doing to me. I had expected some internal signal, a moment where everything resolved into clarity, where I could name what I had become or decide what I would keep. Instead, I found myself living inside a question that refused to collapse into an answer. What changed most during that period was not how others treated me, but how I treated my own reactions. Earlier, every emotional response had felt like evidence, proof that I was either failing or adapting too well. Now, I let them exist without immediate judgment. Discomfort didn't require rejection. Ease didn't require justification. I began to understand that growth isn't always about addition. Sometimes it's subtraction, removing the urgency to define oneself prematurely. Work settled into a rhythm that felt almost intimate in its predictability. I anticipated needs before they were articulated, not because I was trying to please, but because attentiveness had become habitual. This unsettled me in a different way. I worried that competence in this role might be misread as acceptance of its limitations. I worried that being effective here would make it harder to be taken seriously elsewhere. That fear forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I had long equated value with visibility, importance with authority. Performing essential work without recognition challenged that equation. There was a day when someone referred to me as a supportive, in a tone meant to be complimentary. I thanked them reflexively, then spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about why the word lingered like an aftertaste. Supportive was accurate. It was also bounded. It implied contribution without authorship, effort without ownership. I realized then how often praise can be a containment strategy, how language can affirm while simultaneously limiting. That realization didn't harden me. It clarified me. I began to speak more precisely, to claim credit without aggression, to resist the urge to soften statements that didn't require softening. This wasn't rebellion. It was alignment. Each small act of self-advocacy felt like placing a marker, not to challenge others, but to orient myself. Outside the office, the world continued its unremarkable unfolding. Grocery stores, sidewalks, public transit. Spaces I had once navigated without thought now required a constant, low-grade awareness. I learned to scan environments quickly, to assess tone and intention with efficiency. This vigilance was tiring, but it was also instructive. It taught me how much energy some people expend simply to move through the world without incident. I had mistaken my own ease for universality. I would not make that mistake again. Family eventually became unavoidable. My mother insisted on meeting, her concern sharpening into something she could no longer ignore. I rehearsed explanations that felt dishonest even as I practiced them. When we finally sat across from each other, I abandoned the script. I told her the truth, not all of it, but enough to be real. I spoke about accountability, about consequences, about learning things I hadn't known I needed to learn. She listened quietly, the way she always had when something mattered. She didn't understand everything. I didn't expect her to. What mattered was that she tried. She asked careful questions, resisted easy conclusions. When she said she was worried about me, it didn't feel like doubt. It felt like care. That distinction mattered more than reassurance ever could. Afterward, I walked for a long time without destination. I thought about how fear had narrowed my definition of honesty, how much I had withheld in the name of control. I understood then that concealment had been one of my primary strategies for navigating the world. Not deception, concealment. Choosing which parts of myself were permissible, which were expendable. This experience had disrupted that strategy irreversibly. The closer I came to the end date, the less I trusted the idea of going back. There was no back to return to, only forward with more information than I'd had before. I began to imagine future versions of myself, not idealized, not resolved, but more accountable. Someone who would notice who wasn't being heard in a room. Someone who would question why. Someone who would intervene, even when it was inconvenient. My boss scheduled a final review. The meeting was brief, almost anticlimactic. He acknowledged that the arrangement had run its course. He spoke about outcomes, about lessons learned. I listened, aware that his narrative and mine only partially overlapped. He had intended correction. I had undergone transformation. The difference was not something I needed him to recognize. When I left his office that day, nothing felt triumphant. What I felt was responsibility, heavy, steady, earned. I was responsible now for what I knew, for how I would act on it, for how I would resist the temptation to forget. Experience does not automatically confer wisdom. It offers an invitation. Accepting it requires ongoing effort. On my last morning in that role, I arrived early again, just as I had on the first day. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. I moved through the space with familiarity that bordered on affection. This environment had challenged me, reshaped me, revealed fractures and capacities I hadn't known existed. I was grateful for that, even as I was ready to leave. As I stepped outside, the city felt unchanged, indifferent to my internal reckoning. That indifference was grounding. It reminded me that personal transformation does not require an audience. It only requires attention. I understood now that identity is not something discovered once and defended forever. It is negotiated, context by context, choice by choice. What mattered was not how I was seen, but how responsibly I responded, to myself, to others, to the knowledge I carried forward. I did not emerge with certainty. I emerged with clarity of obligation. And that, I have learned, is often the more durable gift. The first day after it ended felt stranger than any day during it. I woke up without the familiar calculus running through my mind, no anticipation of how I would be read before I even spoke, no rehearsal of posture or tone. The absence of that vigilance should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like silence after sustained noise, the kind that makes your ears ring because they haven't yet learned how to rest. I dressed differently, not as a reversal, not as a declaration, but as an instinct. My body moved through motions it remembered from before, but with a hesitation that surprised me. Each choice carried an echo. I realized that habits don't disappear just because the conditions that formed them change. They linger, waiting to be either reinforced or released. Walking out into the day, I noticed how quickly the world reasserted its expectations. People responded to me the way they used to, with an ease that felt rehearsed. Doors opened without comment. My presence was received as neutral again, unmarked. The speed of that transition unsettled me more than resistance ever could have. It revealed how shallow social memory can be, and how much effort it takes to sustain awareness once discomfort is removed. At work, my role had shifted back, at least on paper. Titles were restored, responsibilities expanded. Colleagues interacted with me as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if the previous months were a parenthetical best forgotten. Some of them were kind in their discretion. Others were simply efficient. I did not correct them. I did not offer explanations. But I also did not allow myself to be absorbed back into the old rhythms without question. I found that my attention had changed. Meetings felt louder. Interruptions stood out sharply. I noticed who deferred, who filled silence, who apologized before speaking. I noticed when I did those things too. Awareness, I learned, doesn't belong exclusively to those who are marginalized by a system. It can be cultivated, but only if one resists the comfort of forgetting. There were moments when I felt anger, delayed and diffuse. Not at individuals, but at the ease with which structures reconstituted themselves. At how quickly lessons risked becoming abstractions again. I understood then why people who have lived on the edges of belonging often speak with urgency. It is not because they are reactive. It is because they know how quickly erasure happens, how easily experience is dismissed once it is no longer visible. I had to decide what to do with that anger. Carrying it unexamined would calcify me. Ignoring it would betray what I had learned. I chose instead to translate it into attention, into small, consistent acts that didn't announce themselves as moral gestures but functioned as corrections. I stopped letting ideas go uncredited. I made space deliberately. I questioned assumptions, including my own, even when doing so slowed things down. This was not heroism. It was maintenance. Ethics, I was discovering, are not dramatic. They are practiced in the unremarkable moments where no one is watching closely enough to reward you for doing the right thing. My relationships began to shift as well. With the friend who had listened without judgment, conversation deepened. I found myself more willing to admit uncertainty, to resist the urge to perform confidence as a substitute for clarity. With others, distance remained. Some absences do not heal simply because circumstances change. I accepted that without resentment. Not every connection survives transformation, especially when it reveals asymmetries that were easier to ignore before. Family conversations continued, uneven but sincere. I learned to let misunderstanding exist without rushing to correct it. Understanding, I realized, is not always immediate, and insisting on it can become another form of control. What mattered was openness, the willingness to remain in dialogue even when language faltered. Privately, I grappled with questions I had once avoided. Not about labels or declarations, but about permission. What parts of myself had I disallowed because they complicated my narrative? What softness had I mistaken for weakness? What curiosity had I suppressed in the name of coherence? These questions did not demand immediate answers. They demanded honesty, patience, and a tolerance for ambiguity. I came to understand that my earlier certainty about myself had been less about self-knowledge and more about self-protection. Certainty simplifies. It reduces friction. It allows one to move through the world without explaining too much. But it also limits growth. Living inside a question, though uncomfortable, keeps perception alive. There were days when I missed the clarity of constraint. When rules are imposed, resistance has a shape. Freedom requires discernment, and discernment is tiring. I had to choose, again and again, not to default to old patterns simply because they were familiar. Change, I learned, is not sustained by revelation alone. It is sustained by repetition. I began to think differently about accountability. Not as a consequence delivered by authority, but as a relationship between one's actions and their impact. I could not undo my mistake, nor would I want to. It had been the catalyst for an education I could not have accessed otherwise. What I could do was remain answerable, to the people around me, to the systems I participated in, to the self I was still becoming. Looking back, I resist the urge to frame the experience as redemption or punishment. Those narratives are too clean. What happened was messier and more instructive. I was forced into proximity with perspectives I had previously understood only in theory. I was required to feel what I had once merely acknowledged. And in doing so, I was changed, not into someone else, but into someone less insulated. The final insight did not arrive as a revelation, but as a quiet understanding. Identity is not a possession. It is a responsibility. It asks us to remain attentive to how we move through the world, how we are read, how we respond when that reading shifts. It demands that we resist the comfort of simplification, of ourselves and of others. I carry that responsibility now, imperfectly but deliberately. I know I will fail at times. I know I will be tempted to forget. But I also know what forgetting costs. I have lived on the other side of ease, and I cannot pretend it is universal anymore. If this story has an end, it is not in resolution but in orientation. I am oriented now toward attention, toward empathy that is practiced rather than professed, toward integrity that is measured by consistency rather than intent. I am oriented toward listening, not just to others, but to the parts of myself I once kept quiet. That is what remained when everything else was restored. Not certainty. Not comfort. But a deeper understanding of what it means to be responsible for how one exists in the world. And that understanding, once earned, does not fade easily. What followed was not an ending so much as a long reckoning with continuity, how to live after something has rearranged your internal furniture without asking permission. I discovered quickly that insight, on its own, is inert. It does not compel action. It waits. The real work was learning how to let what I had lived through remain active without letting it become a performance or a private monument I visited only when it was convenient. I noticed first how often I was tempted to narrate the experience to myself in ways that made it manageable. To compress it into a lesson, a takeaway, something transferable and neat. That impulse was comforting and dangerous. It risked turning a lived reality into a credential, something I could reference instead of something I continued to answer to. I resisted that by staying close to the discomfort, not reliving it, but honoring its residue. There were moments when I failed. When I spoke too quickly. When I reclaimed space without checking who I displaced. Each failure arrived with recognition now, a sharp internal pause that hadn't existed before. That pause became the measure of change. Not perfection, but interruption. The ability to stop mid-thought and ask, am I choosing this, or defaulting? I began mentoring someone younger at work, not formally, not announced. Our conversations were practical at first, about workflow and expectations. Gradually, they shifted. He spoke about uncertainty, about the pressure to appear certain before earning it. I listened more than I advised. When he asked how I had learned to navigate ambiguity without freezing, I almost gave him a polished answer. Instead, I told him the truth, that I had been forced to sit with uncertainty longer than I wanted to, and that the sitting had changed me more than any solution ever could. That honesty felt like a small repair, to myself, and perhaps to the future I was shaping indirectly. I also became more attentive to language, especially my own. Words I had once used casually revealed their edges now. I noticed how easily a professionalism could become a code for conformity, how a fit could disguise exclusion, how a neutral often meant unexamined norms. I didn't correct people publicly or dramatically. I asked questions. I slowed conversations down. Sometimes that was enough to shift the current. Sometimes it wasn't. I learned to accept both outcomes without retreating. Socially, I stopped hiding parts of myself that didn't align neatly with expectation. Not through announcement, but through consistency. I allowed softness to coexist with competence. I allowed curiosity to interrupt certainty. Some people responded with relief. Others with distance. Both reactions taught me something about the economies of comfort we all participate in. There were still nights when memory surfaced unbidden. A look in a hallway. A silence after speaking. These recollections no longer stung the way they once had. They functioned instead as calibration tools, reminders of how quickly perspective can narrow when one is no longer required to defend their presence. I treated them like instruments, not wounds. I thought often about my boss, though not with resentment. Authority, I realized, is rarely self-aware. It acts within frameworks it did not design, enforces lessons it does not always understand. I did not need him to validate what had happened. Meaning had already been made elsewhere, in my attention, in my choices, in the ways I refused to let the experience fossilize into anecdote. Over time, I stopped trying to measure who I was now against who I had been before. Comparison implied hierarchy, and hierarchy implied an endpoint. Instead, I began to think in terms of responsibility carried forward. What knowledge did I now possess that required action? What sensitivity demanded maintenance? What blind spots would return if left unattended? The most enduring change was not how I saw myself, but how seriously I took the interior lives of others. I no longer assumed transparency. I no longer equated silence with ease. I understood that many people move through the world performing coherence while managing contradictions they cannot safely articulate. That understanding did not make me gentler in every moment, but it made me slower to judge, and quicker to listen. I have been asked, occasionally, whether I regret it. The question always lands awkwardly, because it assumes a framework that no longer fits. Regret implies an error without yield. What I experienced was costly, disorienting, and irrevocable, but it was also instructive in ways comfort never could have been. I do not seek to repeat it. I also refuse to pretend it was merely endured. What remains with me is not a story about punishment or transformation in the dramatic sense. It is a story about proximity, to vulnerability, to limitation, to perspectives I once acknowledged abstractly and now carry concretely. It is a story about learning that integrity is not proven by how one behaves when seen, but by how one adjusts when the seeing changes. If there is an education here, it is not about gender expression alone, though that is inseparable from it. It is about how identity is negotiated socially, how power redistributes attention, how empathy deepens when theory becomes experience. It is about recognizing that understanding is not a destination one reaches, but a practice one sustains. I move through the world now with fewer illusions about neutrality and fewer defenses against complexity. I know how easily ease can return, how tempting it is to let it. And I know, just as clearly, what vigilance makes possible, not suspicion, but care. This memory does not sit behind me like a closed door. It walks beside me, quiet but insistent, asking the same question in different forms. Are you paying attention? Most days, I answer imperfectly. But I answer. And that, more than any resolution, is where the story continues. Time has a way of sanding down the sharpest memories, not by erasing them, but by integrating them into the grain of daily life. What once felt singular now appears everywhere, not as repetition, but as recognition. I notice it when conversations pause just a beat too long, when someone recalibrates their voice mid-sentence, when a room subtly rearranges itself around who is speaking and who is not. These moments no longer surprise me. They orient me. I am often asked what changed me most. I never answer with the obvious. Not the clothes, not the role, not the sudden visibility of difference. What changed me was learning how fragile confidence can be when it is externally supplied, and how durable it becomes when it is internally examined. I learned that ease is not evidence of correctness, and that discomfort is not proof of error. Both are signals. Ignoring either is a choice. There are still days when I catch myself slipping into old efficiencies, moving faster than thought, assuming alignment where none has been confirmed. When that happens, I pause. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. That pause has become my compass. It doesn't tell me where to go, but it reminds me that I am choosing a direction. I no longer believe that understanding grants exemption. Knowing does not absolve me from acting, it obligates me to act more carefully. I am accountable now not just for outcomes, but for attentiveness. For noticing who bears the weight of a system and who benefits from its silence. For refusing the convenience of forgetting. If there is any peace I carry, it is not the peace of resolution. It is the peace of alignment, the quiet assurance that I am no longer arguing with myself about what matters. Identity, I have learned, is not defended through rigidity but sustained through responsiveness. It is shaped by how honestly one meets the world, and how responsibly one responds when the world answers back. This story does not end with certainty, or with a fixed sense of self reclaimed or replaced. It ends with something less tidy and more durable, an ethic of attention. A commitment to remain awake to context, to consequence, to the interior lives moving alongside my own. I move forward with that commitment intact. Not perfectly. Not heroically. But consciously. And that, finally, is enough.